Welcome to our webinar today. I understand it's a hot day and a very fine day, perhaps the last really hot day you're going to have up there in New Jersey. My name is Bill Baker. I'm with Firestorm. We're located down in Atlanta, and what a privilege it is for us to bring this Crisis Coach webinar series to you. Compliments of the New Jersey MEP. Today we're going to be talking about completing your intelligence network. Take a good look at yourself. This is the 9th in the 2015 series of the Crisis Coach webinars. You can go to firestorm.com and there's a link there that you can follow to watch past webinars and register for future webinars. We also invite you to become our friend. Facebook, Firestorm Solutions, Twitter, Firestorm Soul, and yes, we've even got a hashtag for this session, and that hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Please keep in mind that our presentation today is not complete without accompanying oral comments and discussion. And the work product discussed must be read and considered in conjunction with advice from your organization's personal counsel. In addition, do not interpret the comments or the advice given as legal advice or a legal opinion. We're so pleased to have the New Jersey MEP as our host and co-sponsor of this Crisis Coach webinar series. This is the 9th in the series, as I mentioned, and please go to firestorm.com and get the past webinars so you can get caught up. Our hosts today and moderators, Joe Caratanudo, who's with the New Jersey MEP, and Blair Neville, who is our very own principal in New Jersey. Joe, Blair, over to you, please.
Thanks, Bill. This is Joe Caratanudo, and for those of you that are not familiar, NJMEP's mission is to help small and mid-sized manufacturers in New Jersey to become more productive, more efficient in what they do, and more globally competitive. And we do it through a host of different services that we provide. For example, we help companies with energy and reducing costs and taking advantage of R&D tax credits. We assist companies with lean manufacturing, process improvement, Six Sigma, strategic planning, ISO certification, and a variety of other services, our newest of which is actually assisting companies in reducing the costs of their transportation and logistics. And that's something that you can find out more about by going to our webpage at njmep.org. But Blair, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Joe. And I just want to make a comment that we really appreciate the support of NJMEP in this entire series and their commitment to preparedness for their clients. And at the end of the presentation, we'll talk a little bit about an assessment that we work with NJMEP, and if there's anyone interested, we can do that for them. So Joe, again, thank you very much, and Jim, back to you.
Well, thanks, and thanks to both you, Blair and Joe. We do appreciate the relationship and what we've been working on. And before we started this morning, we were talking about the summer, and everybody needs to congratulate Joe on a big wedding that he had over the weekend for his daughter. So, Joe, you know, it's all a big family here, and we're excited about that and to hear about those details as it came together. Certainly sounds like
Thank you, Jim.
Exciting level. And for those of you who are on the call now, you know that Joe is rich, so he can pay for these big weddings that are out there within it. So I think we're all, our lives are always important, and good news is we didn't have a Hurricane Sandy in the middle of a wedding this weekend, and so it worked out well. As we're thinking about what it is that we don't know, and the title of today's webinar is around take a good look at yourself, completing your intelligence network. We all know what it is that we know specifically, and we, in some cases, we have an understanding of what we don't know, but the focus then is what is it that you don't know? And when you think about what it is you don't know, that's the big exposure that's in all of our companies. Most of us from a manufacturing perspective understand our process, understand what we do, how to make our products and services, how to get them out, the types of services that NJMEP can help us with logistics and tax credits and others are certainly wonderful, and having those assets are coming. But there's a lot out there that we don't know, and we find that we get tests. And sometimes we do a test and an exercise and learn where our plans work, and then sometimes we face a crisis or disaster, and that's a different type of a test that comes into play that we must work with. And so planning those things out really makes a difference in how we look at what's going on. So what we're going to do is focus on that and add that with the foundation that we built over the last 2 months about creating this intelligence network. Now, Firestorm follows a predict, plan, perform process, and we're going to talk about that on a couple of later slides. But as you think about it, there's a lot of different ways to start. And at the beginning, Blair talked about an assessment of understanding where your plans are relative to standards and best practices, and the New Jersey MEP is making that available to everyone. If you would like that, we'll try to reach out to everyone on the call today and give you that analysis. The other is a more detailed benchmark gap analysis. That's where you go in and look at the details of the plans, where the first one is more of a what you feel. This is more identifying where the specific gaps are in a hands-on review and analysis. Then we've talked about earlier in the summer doing a business impact analysis, understanding what the impacts are, the interdependencies, the external dependencies, in looking at your organization, and that leads us to the physical risks that you face. Then we develop strategies, develop plans to respond to those, the crisis communications, the training, the awareness, the exercise, the testing, and then the updating. So this is a continuous growth process as we see new threats emerge, and we certainly see those elements coming in place. So if we think about creating the intelligence network, we want to know all the information before now. If you've got a problem within your company and you're trying to solve it or help a client, if they've got a problem, they want that answer right now. They don't want it later. They don't want you to have to get back to them. They need that solution before it becomes a significant problem. And so the idea of creating this intelligence network helps you focusing on the fact that you can identify your organization's next crisis. And it's not a matter that we can do that. It's a matter that you must be able to do that. That's the reason why you've spent time to go through this webinar series this year, why you're on today, to learn more about what you need to do before now to be able to respond. Now, as you can see from the bottom of the screen, that predict, plan, perform comes up to be the framework by which we go through that process. And so let's look a little bit more about this methodology, predict, plan, perform. Now, predict, you've got to understand what the vulnerabilities, threats, risk, exposures are that your company faces. Identifying those and quantify them becomes very critical, and we'll give you a reference a little bit later to a tool that will certainly help in that respect. The other thing is to understand the impacts. If that happens, what does it mean to my company? What does it mean to our employees, to our customers, and how we come together? And what is it that we monitor, and what are the triggers that would activate our plan? So all of that predictive work needs to be done before we have the event that's triggering whatever our concern is. The plans are the policies, the procedures, the processes, the framework that you can use to be able to make those decisions. And one of the key elements is, when do you activate your plan? And we'll talk about that today and show you another tool in that area to help. And then finally, the perform. What's the training program that you have so that your employees understand what they're supposed to do in a disaster or crisis? How do you make decisions in a crisis? Testing your plans. What are the supplies that you need to have there? What is the monitoring program that you're going to put into place to monitor the risk and exposures that you developed in the predict phase? So as you move forward with each of these areas, then you can start to develop a comprehensive program within your company to run through this process. So what's next? Monitoring isn't the end, and we spent July and August talking about monitoring and listening to what's out on social media. Monitoring could be things like looking at the weather in those areas, but there are other indicators, and later today we're going to talk a little bit more about some of these business indicators that would give you an awareness that something's about to change within your company. But in order for this to work, everybody needs to understand within your organization, within your company, what the possible threats are. They have to be clearly understood. You've got to discuss them. This is not something we're doing in isolation. It's a part of a commitment within the organization as a whole. You've got to then document those and categorize them with specific activities that you would do associated with those threats. For example, if you're responding to another hurricane hit, like Hurricane Sandy, then that gives a specific set of actions that you would go through. If you're responding to a communicable illness outbreak, then that's a different set of activities. Is it something that impact our building, or is it something that's going to impact our people, or is it something that's going to impact our information and data? And clearly cyber breach is at the top of most companies' lists now of exposures as they're thinking together. So creating an environment where you can bring these points forward and start to deal with them becomes extremely critical. So what are the activities that you'd have to do? Because it says group our activities around those particular areas. So there are common threads that relate to every building, every business. Let's look at our building. Let's look at where it's situated. Let's look at what's next door to us on each side and behind us and across the street, those that would impact our egress into and out of our area. Look at if you've got multiple buildings and you're in a corporate campus environment, how is the security related to those? Looking at the customers, the employees, the management. When we have people come on site, are they controlled? Are we identifying those areas? We're seeing consistently an increase in workplace violence. There are 2 million episodes of that annually in the United States. We're seeing domestic violence come into the workplace because the spouse knows this is where the employee will be in this period of time. And so that exposure certainly comes in to have a direct impact onto the company. So actions that we would want to think about is how do we make people aware of what we should be concerned about? And we'll give you 5 areas for you to focus on in just a couple of minutes. How are we going to communicate at each one of the escalation points to see that it's getting worse or better, or the actions that we would need to take? What are our intervention procedures, whether it's a behavior of concern or a fire threat or a tornado or severe weather? How we're notifying not only our employees and our staff, but our key customers, and coordinating those information. And specifically, what's our decision process, and how is our leadership involved in making those decisions? So if we want to take a good look at ourselves and we think about what's next in completing our intelligence network, these are the types of activities that we want to focus on in that process to make sure that our plans align to standards and best practices. So when we think about this, where do you start? Well, the first area that I would encourage you to think about are, here are the 5 common failures that we find in every disaster and crisis. And they're listed in order, by the way. The most common failures: failure to control critical supply chains. As a manufacturer today, you're sitting there and you've got critical suppliers. If they don't deliver the components that you need, or the resources that you need, or the services that you need, you're not going to be able to deliver the products that you have to your clients. So controlling of critical supply chains becomes extremely important. And have you identified your critical suppliers? That should have been a part of your business impact analysis. Do you know what you're dependent on them for? And particularly those that are single source or sole source, those are ones that you want to be validating that they have good plans in place themselves, because if they don't, that will impact your business very quickly in that process. So looking at their plans, validating that, and if you're sole source, then is there somebody else that you could go to if you had to make a change? if suddenly they weren't available because the disaster hit in their area, not where you are, but where they are, and as a result, your supply chain is disrupted. If you don't have an alternative source that you can identify for that, then you're going to need to maintain a buffer inventory of that product, or you will be shut down as a result of that particular exposure. Second is training employees for working at home, and the statistics are very startling. 70% of the employees don't know what to do in a disaster or crisis. So if you've got an emergency plan, it's more than doing a fire drill. You've got to train your employees on what they need to do at work in the event of a disaster or a crisis occurring. And having that documented and have it trained and having it exercised and tested as you go through it. And then that word "and home." 95% of the employees across the country don't have a disaster plan at home. Family trumps job. And so if an employee is concerned about their family, they're not going to come to work. They're not going to be a part of who you are and what you're trying to accomplish at this point in time. And so now you're going to have a specific gap that you're going to need to put in place. So putting a plan there will make a difference. And if you need help with that, you can go to the Firestorm website. There's an ebook that you can download, Disaster Ready People for Disaster Ready America, and it talks about what it takes to build a plan at home, or you can get the book and use that as an employee benefit. And as your employees become more aware of what they need to do at home, that carries over into the workplace to help them be ready there. Third is the failure to identify and monitor all threats and risks. And we see many cases the obvious threats are identified. Coastal exposures, you know the Hurricane Sandy story in New Jersey better than anyone else. In winter storms that are going to come in, and those types of exposures. And if you think about California, you think about earthquakes. And so there are a lot of those things that come straight up. Sometimes they're not as known when you think about behavioral risk. In termination of employee, where they go get a gun and come back. That 2 million episodes of workplace violence annually is a very scary thing. Also, depending upon where you're located, and we've seen political unrest this year with Black Lives Matter and the riots that occurred in Baltimore and Ferguson and other cities. What's your plan if there's a disruption in your area, or if there's a disruption in the area where your suppliers are? How is that going to impact our company in moving forward? We also need to be able to monitor not only weather threats, but personal threats from employees. And this is where the intelligence monitoring could well be an indicator of a quality problem that could trigger a product recall for you. And so establishing an intelligence network for your company that looks across all of those types of things makes a real difference in being able to understand your business. And regularly we will find things out via the reporting on social media that there's an underlying problem that's systemic within the business. Conducting exercises and updating your plan. If you don't test your plan, you don't know it's going to work. And then as you have turnover and as you have changes, or you do an acquisition or you sell something off, how do you go back and update your plans? Last month, many of you, we had 318 companies participating in a virtual exercise where we had them test their plans and benchmark against other companies. We'll schedule another one of those events probably after the first of the year, and that's a good opportunity for you to get your management team around the table and test your plans. At a minimum, you must test your decision processes on your plans annually. If you don't, you're not aligned to standards and best practices. And you can test subcomponents more frequently than that. And last, have a crisis communications plan. If we've identified the vulnerabilities and threats, okay, what does that mean that we're going to tell our employees? What does that mean that we're going to tell our customers? What are we going to tell our regulators? What are we telling our bank on our line of credit if those things start to happen? So planning out your messages in advance, because it's easier to edit than it is to create, makes a significant difference in this process as you think through each of those elements. So where do you start? Start with these 5 things. After you've got your vulnerability threat assessment done, think about these 5 and see how it comes together. You want to follow the predict, plan, perform methodology that we were discussing, and identify and involve those critical suppliers. Look at the very first one here. Look at the critical functions within your business. If you can't do your testing, if you can't do quality control, how are you going to deal with that? If you have problems from a logistics standpoint, what's coming together? Who are your critical employees? We can't run the company if these people don't show up because of the skill set and working in those areas. Conduct the exercise, and then finally establish how you monitor and how you communicate. So where do you start? You attack these 5 exposures, and you involve and do the types of things you see on the right of your screen. So if we move from there, we then need to have a way that all our plans start to come together. And so that framework that should be established is a 5-stage escalation. First is pre-action. That's all the stuff you're doing before anything ever happens. You're on a webinar today. You're hearing about what you need to be able to do by taking a good look at yourself and building on the intelligence network and putting all of that documentation and training and testing together. Then suddenly there's an event that occurs. At that point, we're dealing with onset of that particular area. The exercise we did last month was a lightning strike hitting a building and causing a fire. So what do you do at that very moment of onset and as that fire starts to progress and carry forward? And we're thinking about life and safety and health and environmental issues at that moment in time at onset. Your emergency response plan is activated, and you then start doing an impact assessment. How bad is it? Is this a minor problem? Is this a major problem? What do we need to be doing at this point in time? And you will probably do the impact assessment on 2 levels. One is a very quick initial assessment, see how bad it is. If it doesn't look like it's very bad, then that triggers a set of activities. If you're saying, no, I think our tool and die machines are now impacted on the floor, it's going to impact us here, it's going to have this other element, we lost our test capability, so we may have to send testing outside. What are those impact assessments that are going through? If the impact assessment looks like it's going to be material, if it's going to be large, then you're going to need to then shift over to declaring a crisis, activating your crisis management plan, because when we think about emergency response, those are all tactical things. Now when we shift over to what does this mean to our business and what do we need to put into place, we're dealing at a more strategic level, and that's where senior management is going to be working and trying to solve those problems. So we'd activate our crisis management plan, and then we move into a response and recovery mode, and that's where your business continuity program and your business continuity plans for each department come into play. What is it that you're going to do in accounting or purchasing? What are you doing in the product design or engineering aspects of it, or the manufacturing, the shop floor, the shipping and the distribution, the customer service? How will those things be impacted, and how will you respond into that crisis, and what does it take to recover that function, and what happens if in fact your building is impacted associated with that? And then finally the post, and that's where we're dealing with the consequence management. What are the lessons learned? What do we need to do to go back? And that circle that I showed in a very early slide about a continuous improvement process, and when we think about quality, we think about continuous improvement, that's where this comes together. So we take this simple chart, and then it starts to break down into the details of the plans that underlie it. So have a 5-step activation matrix, that framework that we showed earlier with the pre-action, the onset, the impact assessment, response and recovery, and then finally the post. You want to anticipate and identify the threats. So that's an action item for you. If you haven't anticipated those and haven't identified them, then you've got to establish how you're going to monitor each of those areas, and then have your response team ready to be able to respond depending upon what has actually occurred. Coordinate it with the other response protocols within your business. How does this work if you had a quality problem? What would you start to do associated with it? All of these business risks start to come together. Identify the primary and alternative assignments. Maybe I'm the first person in an area and you're the second. Well, if I'm hurt, you're going to have to take over. And we follow a rule called HR Rule 1, 2, 3. You have to be 3 deep at each one of your critical positions as you work through the disaster. Clear criteria for activation. general response procedures. And the good news is in many of these things, we're either sheltering in place or evacuating, and then we would need to have each one of these threats understood and then documenting the messaging. So this just gives you a summary of the types of activities that you need to start to think about. Now, we talked about identifying the threats and risk, and we're going to talk about that two different ways today. The first is this hazard impact matrix form, and you'll see here we've created a kind of a spreadsheet there where you list the event that's out there, and we start to evaluate that and the probability that it would occur, the onset speed, the forewarning that you would have, how long would it last, the duration, how intense would it be, looking at the human impact, the property impact, the business impact, coming up with a total impact, and then a relative risk score by using the numerics that have all been indicated. Now, as you're thinking about those hazards that you're facing, those risks and threats, I need you to break it into a couple of buckets, and then I'm going to give you a fifth bucket in just a few minutes. The first are all the natural things that could happen. That's the winter storms, the tornadoes, the flooding, the Hurricane Sandy types of things. The biological, those could be spills. It could be communicable illness, the pandemic. Remember the swine flu from a few years ago, or the Ebola scare from last fall. The technology aspects that could happen, the data breach. Many of you are government contractors, and you have specific requirements to secure that data. Well, what happens if your employees, PII or PHI, their personal identification information, identity information, or their health information is out and exposed there? And then any human-induced hazards, that's the workplace violence or the accidents that occur. If you start adding all of those up, we're faced with a great many. So this spreadsheet that you're going to create is going to be multiple pages long, identifying those. Now, even if something's a low probability, we would want to be prepared, but clearly those that come up with a higher ranking go to the top of the list. Then once we've identified that matrix of all of the hazards that we're going to be having, then we've got to have an activation form. And as you see the event activation matrix in the sample that we have done below, and we modify this for every company through this process and looking at it, and we look at the impacts along those dimensions that you see along the left-hand column, dividing it into three categories. One, a low category, which is an incident, a category 2, which is an escalation of an event, and then finally a category 3 that's a crisis. Clearly, the minor things in most businesses, that's kind of business as usual, but those that escalate to that last quadrant suddenly become very significant, and those are the ones that senior management needs to be aware of. And by having clear indicators, it lets your organization understand where that goes. And to further direct that and showing you the structure, looking at those three levels of category, showing you who's responding within your team becomes a key element there. So setting this personnel up, having it understood where the problem goes once the event has occurred, will make it much better from a response level and have a consistency level associated with it. Now what I want to do is to move us beyond some of the traditional things that you think about in each of these areas and start to think about where we're going with business continuity. This is the 9th in the series this year, and we'll continue it on into next year. And we'll be doing more discussion in this coming year around these topics. But you think about business crisis risk, it's an embedded risk within the organization. Something about how your organization is structured, how it operates, or how it functions. We then need to focus on people, profitability, brand, or reputation. What would happen to your company if you lost your largest customer? What would happen if you lost your critical supplier in each of those areas? And so what we want to do is to identify these risks before they in fact occur. That's how we're going to be taking a good look at ourselves and going beyond just the traditional intelligence network and what's important to us. And we need to do all of that before now. We cannot wait until the crisis occurs. We have to get in front of this process and do it before now. So I want to go and break this down a little bit more to give you a framework to think about. And the first area is structural. That refers to the management of the organization, the communication of information, and the behaviors of our senior leadership. That's the structure of who we are. Do you have a centralized control? Do you have a decentralized control within your company? Operational thinks about how the company handles the basic business processes. How do we manage our workflow? What's our project management requirement to maintain that? And then finally, functional refers to the silos within the organization. We find many companies where information is used as a weapon internally, and it's a control, and not being able to know the status of certain elements can make a difference. And then finally, if we want to start to think about the fact that most of these crises can be foreseen, if we have identified those indicators that shape both the frequency and severity associated with it. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about it because this is where we get to that before now and starting to think through it. So as we take business crisis risk and break that down, when we think about a crisis, sometimes they are targeted, sometimes they're complex. What a targeted crisis is something that's easily identifiable. Hurricane Sandy coming was a targeted crisis. It can only become complex if we don't think about it and handle it. So we find that it's much easier to deal with these targeted types of risk than it is dealing with something that's much more complex. Many attributes, competing, a data breach could be an example of that. There's a pressure for management to get it right in this complex area. So if you think about this continuum, to the left we might have the targeted, to the right we'll have the complex in nature. But in addition to that, there's some things to think about the urgency. And not all crises are created equal as we look at it. So this gives us some attribute around it and showing on how long do we have to react to the events there. Something that's reactive and urgent. You're focused on the event. The organization isn't totally consumed by it. If you had a violence episode that occurred within the plant or an accident with a forklift, it's urgent. We need to get that done, but we're not stopping everything we're doing within the company to deal with that single event versus something that's an extreme urgency. The organization is consumed by the event. When Hurricane Sandy was coming in, that consumed all of the businesses in the state of New Jersey to be able to respond and plan to deal with that. And it becomes an overwhelming event around those particular areas. So if we think about the targeted versus the complex, those that are reactive to those that are extreme urgency, now we've come up with a grid, and that's the grid that you see in front of you now with this diagnostic model. Clearly, most of the discussions that are held around business continuity are in that acute quadrant, those there in the upper left-hand side. But the biggest exposure that you have are the other three quadrants. And you'll find us talking more and more about that because those are the areas where you're betting your company. Those are the areas where it could have a severe impact on your business. And so things move from becoming a difficult problem to becoming chronic to becoming severe as it continues to escalate. As those issues move from targeted to complex, as they move from being just some failures to control some processes or coordinate to systemic to poor metrics, even fraud that can come into your organization, and then finally escalate up into a death spiral that can have a significant impact on your business as we think through it. We also want to cut back to the intelligence network and think about creating much more dynamic risk process. And as we think about all the elements that are associated with it, there are tactical actions. That's the audits that you would conduct. Internal audits could be a portion of it. The training and of what are the indicators that we should look at and be aware. The physical security that was involved. I went through a plant just outside of Chicago where they were doing some work as a subcontractor in the defense industry, and they had things that were labeled there that it made it easy for anyone to see exactly what those projects were identified with. So they needed some improvement with physical security at their location. The social media intelligence provides a key portion of that awareness level. The action indicators that, wait a minute, this is starting to happen, we need to trigger our plan. And then finally the communications, all of it. All of those elements will come together as we think about this dynamic risk process by which we can have this intelligence strategy so that we know before the event escalates, before now, what needs to be in place. So we described the predict, plan, perform methodology at the very beginning of our discussion today, and we've emphasized this in many of our webinars over the course of the year. I would encourage you to go back and think about your business in each of these three buckets. Think about those elements that you need to carry forward to make sure that you have all the plans in place associated with it. Now, as you look at it, the if, that's what we're concerned about. If this comes, what's the warning that we're going to get? We have to have everything in place before now. So the next steps are that we've got to think about the consequences of these events, the impacts that we talked about, and we have to define how we're going to measure those, because there are going to be challenges that are ahead of us in our business as we look to the new year. There are many of these things that are strategic versus some that are tactical. We find that a lot of the planning that's done is around that emergency incident response, or the incident command structure within an organization, and that's certainly important to have the tactical areas done. But if you haven't focused on the strategic aspects, you've left a major exposure within your business. The business crisis risk, we talked about the targeted versus the complex, the urgency levels associated with it, and thinking about those difficult, chronic, and severe business risks that are there. The intelligence network is the monitoring that you're going to have in place around the risks that we've been identifying and feeding that in. And then you're going to need instant access to your tools. Instant access, today's standards are that the plans are in the palm of your hand on your smartphone. Thinking about each one of those and being able to get that done. That's something that if you haven't done, it's a way to get your plan in the hands of your people when they need it the most, the instant access tool associated with it. That's the direction the world is moving. And the beauty of that, if it's in the smart device, no one is more than 3 feet away from it. They now have their plan, even if the internet's down because it's downloaded onto their phone. Even if there's no electricity because their phone has a battery associated with it. And that's a way that you can have more control. So I would encourage you to participate in an exercise of testing your plans. If you see that Firestorm is doing another virtual exercise, or if the New Jersey MEP is scheduling one, that might be a good way for you to really identify those gaps. Align your plans to best practices, and we talked earlier about the self-assessment, and I think Blair referenced it as his lead-in, that's something that's been available to you from the New Jersey MEP. You've got to create your own intelligence network. If you do not have one, you're leaving yourself exposed that every crisis that's going to come is a complete surprise. And I normally say that the last time a surprise was good, I was 5 and it was my birthday. If you've got someone running into your office with a surprise, it's not good. So that's an area for us to focus on. And then scheduling the training. There are training programs in place that can help you move through each of these areas. So why don't we stop for a moment, and Joe, Blair, do you guys have any observations that you want to share with our attendees today?
Jim, this is Joe, and I think, one of the things that is important, I think, is for companies to go through, the assessment process of really, identifying what areas specific to their business they're really at risk at. And with this becoming an important part of even the ISO certification requirements for the new 2015 standard, I think it's something, everybody has to do if they want to maintain their ISO certification. But more importantly, if they just want to reduce the risk to their business, it's a prudent move. So.
Good insight there, and Joe is correct in pointing out the ISO quality standards now include risk, and so there's an expectation of your customers that you're doing everything that we've been talking about in this webinar and in the earlier ones. Blair, do you want to add anything to our discussion?
Not too much, actually. Joe kind of stole my thunder there, because everything that you as you walked through the process and talked about how you work through and you put together a very cogent plan of here's the steps to follow. And again, I'll make the statement though that with the changes in the ISO model, that risk understanding of risk is exactly what you were talking about, and to be able to have a plan and the steps to go through the process is key to keeping your certification. But also it's just good standard practices as well. It goes hand in hand with just you know, standards and good practices in a business.
Great insights, and I certainly think you're on target. As we started today, we talked about it's not enough just to say we've done a plan. And we started with the idea that you've got to have a discussion within your company. You've got to bring your team together and talk about these areas, and it needs to become a key part of who you are. You're all focused on quality. You can't be in the manufacturing business and not have an interest in quality, because if you're selling inferior products, you're not going to have customers, you're not going to have a business and to go forward. But you've got to also be concerned about this, because it could have as great of an impact on your company as a quality problem would happen. It doesn't take us long to talk about, well, you remember these people, they used to do that. Well, you don't want to be these people that used to do that. You want to be the ones to carry forward. The New Jersey MEP has made a commitment to try to bring you this information through the webinar series, through the crisis coach workshops, through the individual programs, the assessments, and the other elements that are out there. I think that's a great opportunity for all of you to participate in. But I would encourage.
Jim?
Yes, go ahead.
I just want to make a quick statement. Is that you know, my experience working with Joe and with here in New Jersey, there's a fair number, and probably on the phone there's a fair number of smaller businesses that that are dealing with, as they deal with the larger companies, that some of these requirements are becoming more dramatic, and that you have to be able to articulate what you're doing with these kinds of plans, being able to show the you know, your suppliers that and your, you know, that you have thought this process through. So again, starting with this kind of a concept, to be able to put together a program and a plan and use it as a sales tool, or at least be able to show and articulate to your larger customers, I've thought through this process, here's how we're doing this, can go a long way. And I think it's becoming a bigger requirement. So even outside of the ISO change, companies are going to start to see more and more pressure to show their customers, here's how I'm protecting my business.
Good observation, and 100% on target. A general rule in any of these areas, if you're explaining, you're losing. If you're thinking about, well, the reason why we hadn't thought about that is this, that means you had a problem and you weren't ready. And if you're not ready from this area, you probably aren't ready in other areas, and it could be the difference. Price is extremely important in manufacturing. Everybody wants to get the greatest value, but they need to have components that work. They need to have a product that works. If your company doesn't work because of a disaster or crisis, it's going to have a big impact. So our thanks to the New Jersey MEP for making this Crisis Coach webinar series available to you. There'll be another one in November and December, as we've got some interesting things planned as we think about the editorial calendar for 2016. If there's a particular topic that you'd like to know more about, please share that with us at Firestorm. You can send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com, or you can go on our website, firestorm.com, and fill out a contact form, and we'll work that into our calendars. We think about 2016 and the risk and exposures that are in front of us. Or pick up the phone and give us a call at 800-321-2219. Thank you for being with us and through the 9th in the series. We have numbers 10, 11, and 12 coming up before the end of the year, so we have a lot of information to share. Thanks, everyone, and have a wonderful day. We look forward to speaking with you next month. Goodbye.
Great, Jim. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.